Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 44, King Oliver I? Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the Patreon House of Lords. M. Barney of the Marquisate of Bedfordshire, Earl Frank Bekoski, Earl Bruno Ekman, and also Jesse Hulsizer has been elevated from the Earldom of Rockingham to the Marquisate of Rockingham. If you'd like to join their ranks and not only listen to the podcast ad-free, but help support the show, then go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Thank you to all of my patrons. This show and all my other shows would not be possible without you. Last time we saw how the Protectorate summoned its second Parliament and how the Major Generals attempted to stack it with allies. When that didn't work, they tried to purge it of their most public critics. But as we'll see today, that still left them with many MPs who didn't at all like the new system of military rule they represented. We finished last time with Secretary of State John Thurlow informing the Parliament about the latest plot against Lord Protector Cromwell's life, and so the latest plot against the Protectorate itself. As we touched on, when Cromwell died, whether naturally or violently, the state would be leaderless until the Council of State elected his successor. This had seemed fine during the first Protectorate Parliament, when both the hereditary Stuart monarchy and the Republic was fresh in everyone's memory. But now, only a few years later, the Syndicum plot was just the most recent example of how precarious the Protectorate state could be. It's also possible to see this as another reaction to the rule of the Major Generals. The Council of State would surely be strongly influenced by the military to pick one of their own. Deeply unpopular, if the Major Generals were where unprecedented government led, then perhaps the Commonwealth would be best served by looking to precedent instead. This was also after several years of Lord Brokehill building up a network and a faction in all three former kingdoms. As we also touched on last time, Brokehill has sometimes been called the first British politician, and as you might expect for a lord, he was on the more conservative side. He supported the Protectorate because he supported his friend, Oliver Cromwell. Brokehill was no royalist, but he saw value in the institution of monarchy. And since the second Protectorate Parliament had firmly drawn a line under the Stuart dynasty by disinheriting Charles, the way was now clear for a new dynasty, the House of Cromwell. Brokehill was one of a number of MPs and notables who came to this conclusion, and by the time Thurlow was recounting the attempt on Cromwell's life in January 1657, plans were already in motion. Back in October, an Irish MP and client of Brokehill brought forward a motion for the instrument of government's rules on succession to be revisited, aka that succession should be hereditary, not elected. In November, the issue was raised in the House again, and the Lord Protector's opposition became known. This didn't stop its supporters, and Parliament voted to send envoys to Cromwell to persuade him to accept the principle of hereditary succession. Cromwell was unmoved, and he rejected their suggestion. But supporters of hereditary succession did not go away, and Parliament continued to debate and discuss it, and all the while they were vigorously opposed by the Major Generals. Because, like I said, if Cromwell were to die under the existing articles of the Instrument of Government, and the Council of State elected his successor, Cromwell would likely be followed by the army's pick. The military held so much power and influence that the Council of State would surely follow their recommendations for a new protector, either a puppet of the military or an army grandee himself, most likely John Lambert. The Commonwealth would remain a government by the sword, and critics believed this to be inherently unstable and not a good thing. More concerning, though, was the instability this succession process would surely lead to. The army agreeing on a single candidate was one thing, but what if they disagreed? if the succession was contested, either around the council table or, since the candidates would surely be serving military officers, on the battlefield. These men had all studied Roman history. They were well aware that army generals often declared themselves emperor, and the vast majority who just wanted the chaos to end might then look fondly back on the days of the Stuart monarchy. People around Brogue began asking the question, would the new order not be better preserved by taking some elements of the old? As 1656 closed out, the debate appeared to stall. Cromwell had met with Parliament at the end of November to assent to the new Treason Acts, and when MPs tried to bring up the topic of succession again, he blew them off. Then, the controversy of the Naylor trial stole all the oxygen in the House, using up most of the rest of the year. Then, once Desborough kicked the wasp nest with a militia bill on Christmas Day, that kept the House busy through to the second half of January, which is when Thurlow revealed the Syndicum plot and opened the door once again. The battle over the militia bill and the battle over the succession now converged. The victory of the militia bill would solidify military rule of both the shires and the government. Its defeat would open the door to a more traditional government. In the wake of Thurlow's statement, the traditionalists, usually termed the civilian faction by historians because of their opposition to military rule, struck first. A motion was proposed that, quote, His Highness would be pleased to take upon him the government according to the ancient constitution, end quote. It never used the word king, but everyone in the chamber knew what it meant. In response, Desborough stood and urged the House to adjourn for the day. They should come back tomorrow and finish what they had begun, the debate on the militia bill. The civilian faction agreed. They wanted to bury the army in a good old-fashioned debate. And they did. On the 29th of January, the militia bill was roundly rejected by 124 votes to 88. It was a steamroll, and it firmly put the Major General's collective nose out of joint. So why was it rejected so overwhelmingly? Firstly, many MPs had won their seats by standing against the rule of the Major Generals and everything they represented, or were believed to represent. This included radical politics, extreme religion, and the overturning of the social order. Even after the purge, this meant that a solid proportion of the House had been sent by their constituents to oppose the decimation tax. More MPs joined their ranks in reaction to the behaviour of the Major Generals, whether it was their role in the purge or the attempt to slide their unpopular bill through on the quiet Christmas Day. This played into the perception that the Major Generals were up-jumped commoners who had risen far above their station and were arrogant and heavy-handed. They had usually done so through talent, skill, and luck, which was not seen as a positive to most contemporaries. The debate was far from civil. More than once, the Speaker had to censor MPs for their choice of language about the Major Generals. With hindsight, the defeat of the militia bill shouldn't be a surprise to us, but it was a surprise to the Major Generals, who had entered the debate believing that they had a secret weapon, the support of the Lord Protector. Cromwell had been their comrade and leader long before he had been Lord Protector, and they knew that he wanted the Commonwealth to become a nation of the godly. But before Cromwell had been their comrade, he had been a country gentleman. Though Cromwell wanted to see a moral reformation in England, he was still socially conservative, more traditional, and there were many advocates for tradition around Cromwell. His son, Henry Cromwell, was now in Ireland, but he wrote often to both his father and Brogue, and so also to Thurlow. In these letters, he called the designs of the Major Generals, quote, visibly dangerous. Henry was himself working hard to return the government of Ireland to civilian rule. In addition to Thurlow and Brogue, other traditionalists included Oliver St. John and Bulstrode Whitlock. They regularly met with Cromwell throughout the Parliament, and it's easy to believe that they were building on the Protector's existing foundation of discontent with the Major Generals. Historians such as Paul Lay have pointed out that it's entirely possible that the decimation tax and the rule of the Major Generals might have continued in perpetuity. No one had brought it up until Desborough did on Christmas Day. Cromwell could have dissolved Parliament openly and legally without having to play any lunar versus solar month shenanigans, without the policy being debated in Parliament. Instead, the Major Generals had played their hand, and so allowed themselves to be defeated. Cromwell threw this in their face later on, pointing out that, quote, "You might have gone on. Who bid you go to the House with a bill, and there receive a foil?" Whether Cromwell expected this result, and so gave them enough rope to hang themselves, is another question. But the militia bill was dead, and the following day Parliament voted the government a new tax of £400,000. This could have been the end of the Parliament. It had been called to raise money for the war with Spain and in Jamaica. It had debated religious toleration and firmly rejected the decimation tax, before finally giving Cromwell what he'd called it for. Many contemporaries expected the Lord Protector to dissolve the Parliament now he had what he needed. But instead, Cromwell thanked the House for the money and let it keep sitting. Because though the battle over the Major Generals had finished, it left the civilian faction ascendant, and they pressed the Lord Protector to let the Parliament keep sitting, because they still had business. They were drafting a new constitution. With the militia bill dead and the army MPs on the back foot, the civilians pressed their advantage. Cromwell was convinced that the instrument of government needed to be amended. Both Protectorate parliaments had threatened religious toleration, and he saw the value in having a second chamber to help moderate the House of Commons. Cromwell was open to change, and those closest to him knew this. Throughout these months, traditionalists had regularly met with the Lord Protector. Brokehill, Whitlock, his son Henry, all tried to wear him down, not just on the hereditary succession of the Lord Protectorate, but a new, or old, title, King. They argued that English law, and they almost always referred to English law rather than Scottish or Irish, had a monarch at its centre. There were hundreds of years of acts and precedent which simply didn't work without a king or queen. A Lord Protector kind of fit into this space, but imperfectly. They also referred to cultural expectations. The Lord Protector was an improvisation, an innovation, which radicals and the army grandees might like, but which had no grounding in society. Drawing on traditionalist views of hierarchy, these men around Cromwell described a restoration of the old order: yeoman, gentleman, noble, king. This had been the way it was for hundreds of years. The Stuarts had tarnished the institution of monarchy, but they had been deposed, dethroned, and disinherited. The rump had been in crisis and thrown the baby out with the bathwater when they declared the Republic. But now the crisis had passed, the Stuarts were no longer a threat, and it was time for someone to go and pick up that baby. To restore the monarchy under King Oliver I would also divide any remaining royalists between those who favoured the institution itself and those who wanted the return of the Stuart kings specifically. The lingering conflict with the exiled Stuarts would become a dynastic squabble. In February 1657, the tide had clearly turned against the Major Generals. More and more, Cromwell met with Brokehill and Thurlow and St. John in the informal, personal spaces in his Whitehall apartments. More and more, Lambert and Desborough and the military officers were shut out in the cold. With all these factions and fighting for the ruler's ear, I'm reminded of the good old days with James and young Charles. On the 20th of February, a day of Thanksgiving was held to celebrate Cromwell's survival of the Syndicum plot. After weeks of divisive debates, this was a chance to show off how unified the country, represented by the Lord Protector and his Parliament, were. It began with a solemn service in St. Margaret's Church, but once that was over, the Lord Protector invited the whole Parliament to come back to his place for dinner. The banquet took place in the banqueting house, naturally, and it wouldn't have looked out of place 20 years earlier. Long tables filled the hall, violins and trumpets played music, as the apotheosis of James watched from the ceiling. Once the food was out of the way, everyone was invited to join Cromwell at a show, and soon Charles's old court theatre was packed with MPs, officers, and the Lord Protector himself. They enjoyed a performance of singing and music that lasted into the evening. It was a celebration, not only that Cromwell hadn't been blown up, but that the difficult weeks were now over. The Lord Protector himself was in a great mood. At the banquet, Thomas Pride spilled some candied peaches on one of the servers. Cromwell mockingly told him off, throwing his napkin at him, and the table erupted in laughter and backslapping. Later, at the concert, the Lord Protector gave his cousin, Henry Cromwell, his red cloak from his shoulders. Whichever side of the militia debate they had been on, the Lord Protector was showing that no one was out of favour. After the party died down and everyone went home to nurse their hangovers, the inner circle of the civilian faction spent the weekend putting the final touches to their project. On the Monday morning, Parliament gathered and prepared to begin the day's session, when a man stood up. Sir Christopher Pack was his name, and he asked the Speaker to put forward a new proposal for the House to debate. He said it was for the, quote, settlement of the nation and of liberty and of property. This proposal was immediately supported by Secretary Thurlow and Bulstrode Whitlock. The Major Generals had particularly enjoyed the Thanksgiving party, not because of something that had happened, because something didn't. London was swirling with rumours, wondering what the traditionalists were up to, and their wish for a return to a monarchy was well known. The Major Generals had spent the last few weeks firmly out in the cold, away from these discussions. Their worst nightmare was that the civilians could use the celebration of the Thanksgiving, where nearly every notable in the Commonwealth was in attendance, to offer Oliver Cromwell a crown. It would be a fait accompli. Everyone present would surely have to swear loyalty to King Oliver I, and they would be irrevocably tied to the new monarchy. So it was with not a small amount of relief that the festivities went off without a hint of a coronation. But when Pack stood up on that Monday morning, the Major Generals and their supporters understood that this was the attack they'd been expecting. When it hadn't materialised at the Thanksgiving, some of them had hoped this meant that the danger had passed. They now realised that this was the moment. John Lambert, Charles Fleetwood, John Desborough, all loudly attacked Pack's proposal. One of them argued that Pack had kept his proposal too vague for them to know if it was even worth debating. But debate it they did, and Pack's proposal, called the Remonstrance because we simply haven't had enough of them, passed its first reading by 144 to 54. The Major Generals were outraged, and as a group they marched out of the chamber and demanded a meeting with the Lord Protector the following day. So what was in this new proposal? Pack presented it almost as a piece of improvisation, but this was just a bit of theatre. Pack hadn't even read the thing. The Remonstrance was the work of dozens of Irish and Scottish MPs, led by Broghill and Thurlow, and put together over weeks of meetings. At its core, this Remonstrance wanted to restore the ancient constitution of England: King, Lords, Commons. The Lord Protector would become a king and be more bound to precedent and law. It would not be an absolute monarchy, but the king would have a parliamentary veto. The Council of State would be renamed back to the Privy Council, but most of its powers would be transferred back to the king. Parliaments would meet every 3 years, with the House of Commons controlling taxation. A new upper house, called the Other House because they couldn't settle on a name, would act as a constitutional brake and protect the Commonwealth from radical MPs. This other house would be made up of around 60 members appointed by Cromwell, rather than being the domain of bishops and peers. Religious toleration would be extended to everyone, except for Catholics and extreme sects of Protestantism. Most royalists would be permitted to return to political office, stand for election, and play their traditional roles in society, as long as they renounced Charles Stuart and swore loyalty to the new king. Originally, the title of king would once again become hereditary. But during the Thanksgiving concert, Cromwell had once again made it very clear that he did not support a hereditary succession. This clause of the Remonstrance was hurriedly scratched out. In its place was the requirement that Cromwell declare his successor prior to his death. It wasn't hereditary, it wasn't elective, and it still threatened chaos if Cromwell died before declaring his successor. But it was a compromise which the Protector might accept. The day after the Remonstrance's first reading, around 100 army officers, led by Lambert and Desborough, met with their former general, current Lord Protector, and possibly future king. These were men who knew Cromwell intimately. They had fought by his side, risked life and limb along with him, and some of them were family, married to daughters and cousins. They expected Cromwell to share their horror and outrage, or at the very least lend them a sympathetic ear. Instead, they faced one of the Lord Protector's rare but fiery rages. "What would you have me do?" he asked them. This Parliament had been their idea. They had promised it would be full of supporters, and instead they'd had to purge 100 MPs, and even still struggle to control it. It was they who had brought this fight to Parliament with the Militia Bill. It was their extremism which had antagonised people so much. And after all of this, they had the gall to come to him and complain about the mess they had created. With his audience stunned into silence, the Lord Protector countered their complaints. The current system was clearly unworkable. The House of Commons needed to be balanced by another chamber, one that could keep the extremism of MPs in check and preserve religious toleration. If they didn't, then how could Cromwell believe that the next Parliament wouldn't need purging too? And as for their fear that he would take the title of king, well, that was a decision for him. He would make it, and it was between him and God. Being called king instead of Lord Protector was but a feather in a cap, he said. Taking the title would also restrict his powers more than the instrument of government already did, so the title itself didn't threaten tyranny. Then he dropped the bombshell. This was not the first time he'd been offered the title of king. Was it, John? Lambert's first draft of the instrument of government had included the title of king, and it was only Cromwell's rejection back then that forced the hasty rewrite to Lord Protector. But not everyone in the room had known this. Lambert's leadership in this affair was fractured by this reveal, and this, combined with Cromwell's authority and his counterpoints, meant that the officers were thoroughly deflated by the time the Lord Protector brusquely dismissed them. Oliver Cromwell had firmly broken with the military. But don't think this means that Cromwell was happy with the Remonstrance, because he wasn't. His feedback was noted, and the Remonstrance was redrafted and renamed the Humble Petition and Advice. Over the following weeks, Parliament debated the Humble Petition clause by clause. Royalists and Catholics were once again barred from politics, but anyone elected could only be disbarred from their seats on the agreement of the rest of Parliament. No more purges. Parliament would make the laws, set taxes, and decide who would sit on the Privy Council. The army would only be deployed with parliamentary consent. A confession of faith was agreed to, which the Presbyterians wanted, and laws against Quakers and other radical sects were tightened. Toleration was therefore reduced under this new constitution, but this would be as harsh as it got. The new upper house would be appointed by Cromwell and sit for life, and he would surely choose men who agreed with his view of toleration. They would act as a backstop, an upper limit on how intolerant the state could be. This new upper house was also not hereditary. When a holder died, the seat became vacant and did not pass to his heir. The principle of a nominated succession passed with little debate. Finally, they reached the most contentious point, that Oliver Cromwell should, quote, assume the name, style, title, and office of King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, end quote. This was the biggie. It had been delayed till last, so that Parliament could agree on the less controversial articles first, but they couldn't put it off forever. On the 24th of March, the door to St. Stephen's Chapel was shut and locked. The MPs were not allowed to leave without permission until this matter was settled. Were England, Scotland, and Ireland going to have a king once again? The debate raged long into the night and into the following day. More than one grizzled, hardened veteran of the civil wars sobbed as they begged their fellow MPs not to turn back the clock. Supporters of the article urged their colleagues to see this as the best way to heal the nation and protect the gains the revolution had made. Finally, the vote was held. 185 MPs made their choices. 62 voted against the motion. 123 voted for it. I'll quote from Anna Keay's Restless Republic here. There was no longer any doubt. The elected representatives of the nation were inviting Oliver Cromwell to adopt a new constitution and to assume the crown. Most of the big constitutional shifts of the last decade had happened without parliamentary consent. Here at last was a constitutional formulation that had originated in Parliament and had secured its unequivocal support. End quote. Now all that was needed was for Lord Protector Cromwell to give his assent, and he would immediately transform into King Oliver I of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The Speaker presented the completed humble petition and advice to Cromwell in the banqueting house. The petition was bound in vellum, and a clerk read it out line by line to the Protector. The Speaker explained what Parliament had presented, and especially focused on the title of King. I'll quote again, this time from Alice Hunt's Republic, Britain's Revolutionary Decade. The Speaker presented Parliament's new constitution as a metamorphosed body. It was essentially the same, just in a slightly different form and with a new name. Parliament liked the body well, the Commons and the other House, and they approved of the head. They just did not like the title Protector. They wanted something that was familiar and known, and which had ancient biblical roots. They wanted a title that was known in law, and that was, importantly, understood to be below and not above the law. They wanted a king. End quote. Lord Protector Cromwell thanked the Speaker and his Parliament for their work on the humble petition and asked to be given time to consider their proposal before answering. He needed time to think. He needed to speak to his friends, family, and advisers, and most importantly, for a man like Oliver Cromwell, he needed to pray. As he told the Speaker, this was, quote, the greatest weight of anything that was ever laid before a man. The Speaker agreed, but warned him, quote, they are all bound up in one link or chain, or like a building well knit and cemented. If one stone be taken out, it loosens the whole. End quote. In other words, he could not pick and choose what he liked and what he didn't. It was all or nothing. And that is where we will leave off today. Next time, we'll try and follow Cromwell's thoughts as he wrestles with his conscience and decides whether to become king or not. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, Sue Bremner, the Duchess of Wellington, Philip Allen, Marquess of Beaumont and Cresford, and Lloyd Collins, Earl of Portland. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. The other best way to support the show is to tell someone about it, share it with a friend, or post about it on social media. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.